Chapter 5.1. The birth of Islam heralded a rival to Christianity and has led to many wars. In 732, Christian troops under Charles Martel stopped Arab armies from expanding beyond Spain. In the early 1500s, Muslims were forced out of that country. Christians retook what is now Israel in 1099 and ruled for less than 100 years, before being ousted by the forces under al-Nasir Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub Saladin to Westerners. For the next few centuries, multiple Christian crusaders died in the effort to recapture what they still call the Holy Land. In 1453, the last remnant of the Roman Empire disappeared when Ottoman soldiers overran Constantinople, now Istanbul. In 1683, Ottoman troops reached as far as Vienna, Austria, before being repelled. Amid the tension, the gestation of new religions never stopped. In this chapter, we will be looking at religions that were formed after Islam to the 1500s. The Roman Catholic Church dominated Western life for about 1,000 years, from the 400s through the 1400s. As a result, anyone who offered a belief that differed slightly from perceived orthodoxy faced long odds and certain opposition. Nevertheless, people tried. The Inquisition was established by Pope Gregory Roman IX around 1292 to fight such heresy, leading to massacres and burnings at the stake. In addition, the Western world was changing. Breakaway sects were buoyed by anti-cleric sentiment that became commonplace throughout the 12th century. In Italy, the stirrings of what would become the Renaissance began to make an appearance, flowering across Europe by the 1500s. Scientific study, initiated by monks like Roger Bacon, were starting to make inroads against church teachings. The University of Bologna, founded in 1088, increased the level of education and was joined by other centers of knowledge, leading to debates over church claims. At the same time, religious scholars began closer examination of the biblical text. Translations were still illegal and found no reference to the Pope, Curia, or some of its teachings. Their discussions would light the fire that led to Martin Luther and the Protestant explosion in the 1500s. The Church involved itself in political fights, which undermined its religious authority and encouraged peasants to rebel. Meanwhile, the Church was indulging in massive building projects and seemingly no longer as concerned for the needy in communities. As a result, the Church was becoming increasingly separated from its flock. Mass was conducted in Latin, which not even the priests understood. The first attempts to translate the Bible into vernacular appeared since the Latin Vulgate in the 4th century, highlighted in the 1300s by John Wycliffe, whose translations led directly to the King James Version of the Bible. Judaism. Judaism, too, had its share of sects, one that is still around. Samaritans trace their lineage back to Joshua, the mythic leader of the Jews after the death of Moses. Today, its population numbers less than 500 people. Another that survives began in the 8th century and was started by Onan ben David. Originally called Ananists, they are better known as Karaites, people of Scripture. Little is known about Ben David, who was reportedly born around 715. The earliest mention of him occurs in writings of people opposed to his teachings. Nevertheless, he seemed to have been competing with his brother Hananiah to be leader of the Jews in voluntary Babylonian exile, which became known as Diaspora Greek, to scatter about. Many Jews had returned to their native Judea close to 1100 years earlier, but those who chose to remain in Babylon developed their own leadership. An exilarch who served at the pleasure of the ruling caliph once the land was under Muslim control. When Hananiah won the post, Ben David began to call himself the anti-exilarch, which led to his arrest after organizing his followers. By then, Ben David was already known for being associated with a pseudo-messianic movement with anti-Talmudic tendencies. Written separately in Babylon and Jerusalem, and then combined into a single volume, The Talmud is a collection of writings and biblical commentary that has served as a guide to Jewish life. Facing execution, Ben David argued that his movement was separate from Hananiah and therefore not governed by the same laws. Add in enough bribes and Ben David won his freedom. Tying into the small undercurrent of opposition to Talmudic law and the authority of the Exilic, Ben David produced his own Sefer HaMitzvot, Manual of Precepts, in Aramaic, proclaiming his views. His main goal was to separate from Rabbinic Judaism, which had emerged after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. In the aftermath of that disaster, rabbis, teachers, replaced the sages who had developed many of the Jewish traditions. Rabbis accepted oral law, the interpretations recorded in the Talmud. In contrast, Ben David rejected the Talmud completely, turning to the Bible for guidance. He demanded followers stop eating unacceptable food, except reindeer and pigeons. He refused permission to light a fire on Sabbath Saturday or Sabbath Eve, a real hardship in the days before electricity. For Sabbath, his followers were only allowed to pray, presumably for heat. He increased fast days and turned existing feast days and times of mourning, following the statement in the Bible. "And I will turn your feasts into mourning and all your songs into lamentation." Hosea 8:10. Medical assistance was limited by another verse. "If thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and wilt do that which is right in his sight, and wilt give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee." Exodus 15:26. Nevertheless, Ben David attracted widespread support from scholars and lay people. They were drawn to the idea that he was a Prince Nasi from the line of King David. Ben David means son of David. The ancient king, who reigned around 1000 BCE, was associated with the idea of an anointed king. Messiah, in Greek, who would recover Judea from whoever was ruling and turn it into a Jewish theocracy. After Ben David's death around 790, new leaders softened some of his rules. At one point claiming 40% of Jews, Karaites called themselves roses in contrast to the rabbinical thorns. The ideology seeped into Egypt and Syria before moving into Europe through Spain in the west and Constantinople in the east. Today, a few believers still exist, principally in Los Angeles. Bogomils. Around 300 years after the mass pyres of the Paulicians in the 7th century, a Macedonian village priest named Bogomil, dear to God, picked up on Paulician teachings and combined it with other ideas to create his own religion in an attempt to reform the newly created Bulgarian Orthodox Church. While little is known about his life, he railed against wealthy priests and nobles, labeling them the servants of the devil. He would refer to the gospel while preaching about the differences in lifestyle between Jesus and wealthy priests. His diatribes drew hordes of followers from the poor residents in Macedonia and Thrace. Long after his death, followers continued to flock to his successors. By the late 12th century, Bogomil's teaching formed the state religion in Bosnia. Like the Paulicians, the Bogomils looked back to the purity of early Christianity. They discarded the Jewish Bible, an idea advocated by Marcion 8 centuries earlier. They rejected the Trinity, calling it delusional. They refused to respect the cross, saying, "If someone killed the king's son with a piece of wood, do you think the king would regard the weapon as holy?" Adopting the dualism espoused in Zoroastrianism, Docetism, and Paulician, they refused to venerate Mary and believed God, not Jesus, would execute the final judgment. On a personal level, they advocated vegetarianism and celibacy. Their views eventually were drowned in blood. In 1222, Pope Clement Roman IV declared a crusade against the Bogomils. The Hungarian army led the assault and was thrown back. In 1408, the Hungarians returned and cheerfully beheaded Bosnian noblemen, an act that led the Bosnians to support the invading Muslim forces. The Ottoman Turks under Sultan Mehmed Roman II conquered Constantinople in 1453 and then moved on to seize Bosnia 10 years later. Had it not been for the intolerance of the papacy, we would not have had Turkey in Europe for 500 years. Rebecca West, Black Lamb and Grey Falcon, A Journey Through Yugoslavia. In time, many of the Bogomils converted to Islam. Those who did not were respected by the various sultans and served as grand viziers and statesmen in the succeeding years. The ethnic cleansing of the 1990s evolved from the long-standing animosities between Bosnians of differing religious views.